Hey there, and welcome to DIY Projects with Pete. Today we're going to build a sliding barn door. Let's get started.
The first step is to measure the door opening. I typically like to build the barn doors about 4 inches wider and 2 inches taller than the opening so it overlaps each side by a couple of inches. Next, grab a sheet of plywood and transfer the measurements to it. Since we'll be wrapping the door with 3/16 of an inch steel, you can subtract about 3/8 of an inch off the width and height of the plywood to account for it. Then you can use a circular saw to make the cuts. A straight edge can be helpful, but if you can follow the line closely by eye, that's going to work just fine. Now it's time to start making cuts. I cut 32 pickets down to 37.5 inches. Make sure you allow the pickets plenty of time to dry out before working with them to minimize shrinking and gaps between the boards. And it does help to set up a stop jig on your table saw to make the process of cutting go much quicker. Use a table saw to rip down the end boards if needed, then lay all the boards out and organize them how you'd like. Next, attach the pickets using a combination of construction adhesive and brad nails. Line up the pickets so they're flush with the edges of the plywood, and you can work from one end to the other to secure each picket. Once that first side is complete, flip the door and repeat the process. Put the boards together as close as possible, and you can use nails to secure each board in place. Then rip the end board as needed to make it fit just right. Fence pickets are usually pretty rough, so you'll want to sand them down a bit to smooth over the boards. I used 120 grit sandpaper to do this. You can sand them completely smooth, but I still wanted some texture, so I didn't sand them down all the way. Add a few more nails as needed, and then sand the door edges to clean things up. Apply a finish of your choice. I wanted to seal the boards, but to keep the cedar looking as raw and natural as possible, so I used a clear satin water-based sealer. It initially darkened the wood, but as it dried, it lightened it up and had a real natural look. Give the first side time to dry, flip the door, seal the back side, and then once dry, you can sand the door by hand with some 500 grit sandpaper to give the door a nice smooth finish. Next, lay out the 3/16 of an inch by 2 inch wide metal flat bar and determine the lengths to cut it. You'll need 4 total pieces. The long vertical pieces will overlap the edges of the smaller top and bottom pieces. You can cut the metal using a cut-off saw, or a reciprocating saw will work well too. Work your way around the door until all 4 pieces are cut and fine-tuned to the correct lengths. Use an angle grinder with a flap disc or a bench grinder to clean up the edges. Measure and mark for holes we'll drill so we can attach the metal to the wood with screws a little bit later. I used 3 screws on the top and bottom and 6 screws on each vertical side. A drill press is going to make it pretty easy to go through the metal. You could use a normal drill and metal bit, but it's going to take quite a bit longer and it's going to be more tedious. Keep the drill bit cool by spraying it once in a while with some WD-40. Seal the metal with a clear matte spray sealer and spray paint the screws with a dark metallic paint to match the color of that cold rolled steel. Add construction adhesive to the steel prior to attaching it with screws. Line it up and then pre-drill holes at each screw location. Then you'll want to secure the metal to the wood with 1.5 inch screws. Move on to the next side and determine placement for the holes. Space them somewhat evenly and make sure to have a hole pretty close to each end. Drill each hole with your drill press and then clean up the rough areas on the metal with a grinder. Lastly, seal it prior to attaching it. Add construction adhesive and screw the metal to the sides. Work from one end to the other and continue around the door until all 4 sides are completed. Now it's time to make the door hardware, and after doing a lot of research for affordable wheels and hardware, I ended up deciding to use April Wilkerson's advice from wilkerdoos.com. She has a huge selection of awesome DIY projects, and I'd highly recommend checking out her tutorial for barn door ideas as well. She does a different style barn door, but the hardware I used is done very similar to hers, with the main modification being to where the wheel is placed on the metal. So definitely check out and subscribe to April's channel by clicking the link to her YouTube channel in the description. I cut the 2 pieces to 16 inches in length and drilled 2 mounting holes in it to attach the door and 1 larger for the wheel. I wanted to see the spacing I'd have with the rail in place, and you can see I'll have about an inch of room between the top of the door and the wheel if mounted in a similar location. When drilling the holes, start with a smaller bit and progress to the final size with a couple different bit sizes. This will make it easier to get a precise hole placement and to get through that 1/4 inch thick metal. Spray paint the bolts, washers, and nuts, then decide where you want to place the metal on the door. I went with 9 inches of metal on the door and 7 inches off. Square up the hardware and then pre-drill through the entire door prior to attaching it with bolts. I used 1/2 inch bolts through the door along with a washer on each side and a nut on the back side. For the wheel mount, we'll use a 5/8 inch diameter bolt with a few different sized washers, which is going to enable the wheel and bearings to freely turn. And this was another of April Wilkerson's ideas that was super helpful. So I used a normal 5/8 inch washer on the front of the steel, and then 3 of the 16mm washers, then the wheel, 1 more 16mm washer, and finally a nut. For the back side of the door, I used a 1/2 inch washer and nut. First tighten by hand, and then use a wrench or a socket set to tighten everything up. Now it's time to carry the door inside and put it in place. Find a friend or family member to help out with this because the door will be heavy. I used a scrap board that was a 1/2 inch thick to simulate the height I wanted to hang the door at. Find the studs in the wall. They're usually at about 16 inches on center, which was the case for me. Mark the stud locations and also mark the level the rail should be placed at. Where the V of the wheel on the bottom side forms is the height you'll want the top of the rail to be at when the door is propped up on that scrap board. I decided to make a spacer board to add room between the door and the wall. I ripped it down to 3 inches in width and cut it a little longer than 2 of the barn door widths so the door could open completely to the left side of the opening and give access to the light switch. Transfer the stud marks to the board to make sure everything will line up correctly. Next, you'll want to make the rail. Cut the 2 inch by 1/4 inch thick metal so it is a little shorter than the spacer board. Then transfer the marks to the metal and check to make sure they'll line up perfectly and are 16 inches on center or whatever they need to be to match up with the studs or wall mounting locations. Then measure down 1.25 inches for where the leg bolts will go. They need to be slightly under center so the wheels will glide freely over the wood dowel spacers, which you'll see in a later step. Drill a hole through the wood for the leg bolt to go through that matches up with the holes in the metal. Then create additional spacers so there is room between the door and the wall. I made 1.5 inch spacers out of a wood dowel and drilled a hole through the center of them. You'll need a wood spacer for each hole you have in the rail. Once they're all drilled, paint the dowel spacers and the board spacer to match your wall. Level and attach the board spacer to the wall with wood screws at each stud. Then drill a pilot hole at each hole location into the wall so the leg bolts will go in without splitting the studs. Next, put up the rail by putting a dowel spacer and then the rail followed by a washer and leg bolt. You'll want to do this for each hole location and double check to make sure you go into a stud each time so the rail is secure. Use a socket wrench or a socket attachment on your drill to put in the leg bolts. If everything goes as planned, it will be rock solid and made to hold a lot of weight. Lift the door into place and roll it side to side to make sure it slides freely. You may need to rotate the spacers a bit if it isn't sliding like it should. Jazz up the door with a handle on the front side. I used a bar pull handle to kind of go with the Scandinavian style theme I'm trying to get for my home office that I'm remodeling. I had to get some 2.5 inch long bolts to mount the handle so I could get through the 2 inch thick door. For the back side of the door, I embedded a round pole, and I used a hole saw and a chisel, but you could use a router tool to create the hole for the pole. Use construction adhesive, and then push the pole handle into the hole. I made stops for the door out of angle iron. Cut 2 pieces, clean them up with a grinder, and then drill a hole in each on the drill press. Decide where each stop should be on the rail, and then drill a hole in the rail where you'd like them to go. Then attach with an inch-long bolt and add a felt pad or a piece of rubber to each stopper. Next, I made a channel or a track to keep the door in place. I made it out of some leftover angle iron I had sitting around and drilled a few holes in it so I could screw it into the floor. The track is a bit longer than most since I needed to be able to slide the door far enough to clear the light switches, but it only needs to be about an inch or two wide if you don't have to worry about switches. I've also found some options available online, which are linked to in the post on my website in case you don't want to build your own track. Line up the track to fit the width of your door, and then use some screws to secure it to the floor.
All right, thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Cheers from Bozeman, Montana.
For more DIY inspiration and project ideas, please subscribe to the channel and check out some of the other project videos. Click on the left thumbnail to see how to build an outdoor concrete coffee table, and on the right thumbnail to see how to build a simple workbench. For more photos, directions, and plans to today's video, check out DIYpete.com/barn door. Thanks again for watching, and best of luck with your upcoming projects.